Birth plans are a really personal choice. Some people want a really detailed plan which will tell them everything that's going to happen and every detail of what their ideal birth would look like. But other people will just say, I just want to go with the flow and see what happens. In my own experience, I've developed my own thoughts about what a birth plan might be helpful to people, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. Now, going with the flow can work really well for people who actually are genuinely really laid back. They're quite happy. They're not going to give themselves a hard time for anything that happens afterwards, and they just feel like that really will suit them, and actually they don't want to know a lot more than that because it will probably make them more anxious or more stressed beforehand. So that's great if that's you. Some people, however, think they want to go with the flow, and then actually when it comes to it, they go with that flow and afterwards think, oh, well, I didn't know about that choice, and if I'd have known about that, I might have done things a little bit differently. So if you are going with the flow, it would be really helpful, whatever, regardless, that you understand and you know as much as you can do about labour and birth and about the possible things that might happen to you in your labour and birth, so you can feel really, really well prepared for that. The other choice is that you might be somebody who does want to make a birth plan. Now, people don't like birth plans sometimes because they say, well, you can't plan for what happens because anything could happen in labour and birth. There are a multitude of other directions. Think of it like branches on a tree. And you start off all at the beginning, being pregnant, and all different ways that your birth experience might go for you. So why would you try to plan for that? You can't be sure it's going to happen. It could lead to disappointment. Some people then say, well, let's call it a birth preferences. That's your preferred thing. Now, the way I do it and the way I sort of could recommend to you is that you have a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C. Now, your plan A is kind of like your birth preferences. That's everything that you would hope to happen in your ideal birth experience, and you would prepare for that. But your plan B is kind of like a way for you to get your head around the fact that sometimes you might not be able to get everything on your plan A, and that things sometimes might change and might deviate. It gives you a chance to think about those other choices you might make. For example, plan A might say, I don't want any pain relief whatsoever, I just want to do my breathing techniques. But whilst you're in labour, you might change your decision and think, actually, no, I do want pain relief. But because you haven't thought about your plan B, you might end up with an epidural and afterwards think, oh, well, I didn't know there was other things that were available to me other than an epidural. I wish someone had told me. So your plan B would be, if I do decide I want pain relief in labour, these are the pain reliefs that I do want, these are the pain relief options that I would not consider. Just for an example there. And your plan C could be what happens if you ended up needing an emergency caesarean section. Because up to about 30% of people will end up with a caesarean section. So it's a really good idea just to at least have thought through that situation. I've had people before who've come to me and they've said, oh, do you know what? I went to these birth classes and I just had a birth plan and I didn't get what I wanted. And they didn't even consider the fact that things might go differently. It might not go the way I hoped it would. And that if I did everything right, then I would get the birth I wanted. So now I feel because I didn't get the birth I wanted, that actually I did something wrong. And they absolutely did not do that. That is just the situation, the circumstances, when we're managing risk all the time to try and keep mums and birthing parents and babies as safe as we possibly can do during that new experience. So really have a think about that plan B. Have a think about those other things that, okay, if this happened, then I would consider this, but I wouldn't consider that. And your plan C, like I've said, is that preparing for caesarean section. If this happens, what do I want to happen in theatre? What's important to me? What about the bright light? Because again, for example, if you have sensory issues with bright lighting and you've worked with that for your birthing room for your plan A birth experience, but not for your plan C, it'd be really helpful to have thought through all of those things. Now, as an autistic person, you might find that there are different needs that would be on those birth lists compared to a neurotypical person. So, for example, you might want to think about your interaction and your communication needs and styles. You might want to think about your sensory needs and what might be going on with that. There's a multitude of other things that might be helpful for you. So, for example, keeping cool might be really, really important, but the hospital might have a policy to keep the wards really, really warm for when your baby arrives. So it might be that you need to think about, okay, what can I do to help to keep me cool, for example. It might be that there are things that you don't want the midwives to say to you, language that you don't want to use, that you might find that particularly triggering. Or again, like I've mentioned, that you want the lighting to be kept as low as possible, for example. So it's really important when you're working on your birth plans that you think about all the things that you might need as an autistic person, as well as just the questions and preferences that you might have in order to give birth the way that you would hope to do so. The other things that I've sort of going to mention now are things like the smells. Do you want particular smells in the room? What about the sounds? What about the voices that are used with you? What about how people talk to you? What about how people touch or don't touch you during your labour and birth? You've absolutely got a right for all of these adjustments to be made during your labour birth experience and afterwards when your baby is born. So have a think through and add those to your birth plan. My advice would be that when you write your birth plans, you have a copy for yourself. You have a copy that could be left on the desk in the birthing room so that the person caring for you, even as they change care providers, and because your midwives will change shift to shift, for example, that they can read that for you as well, and perhaps have a copy that's saved into your notes as well. Your birth partner can ask each person who's coming into the room to care for you, please can you check that you've read the birth plan? And that having that plan B will be really helpful, because at the time that you need it, if it does change, if plan A does change, you also know that they've read the plan B and they know what your preferences are if the situation changes.